Well, the Huns were the granddaddies of the Comanche. They lived, breathed, and died by the horse. They developed the stirrup, which allowed them to stand up in the saddle and sling arrows and swords with a deadly accuracy. They rode from China to India to Europe, plundering and terrorizing, feasting on raw meat, which they tenderized between their thighs as they rode, dressed in the skins of field mice, which they wore until those skins rotted off. Let me put it this way. Attila and the Huns gave a new meaning to the word fierce.
He was very good at what he did. He was very good at raping and pillaging and breaking down the defenses of the Roman Empire.
In the first 7 years of his reign, much of Europe fell to Attila and his Huns. But despite repeated attempts, Attila had yet to capture Constantinople. He would get a little help from Mother Nature. In 447 AD, a series of catastrophic earthquakes rocked the city, far worse than anything Byzantine engineers had anticipated. It was the opportunity Attila had been waiting for. 57 towers were leveled by the tremors, leaving the city unprotected. Attila's army was once more on the march, threatening Constantinople. From the rubble, Emperor Theodosius rallied Constantinople's people to help not only rebuild the defenses, but to make them even more formidable than before. But with the Hun army fast approaching, thousands of citizens had only weeks to repair walls that had taken years to build. But the Byzantines would take no chances. The new and improved Theodosian walls would now incorporate a triple line of defense.
There must have been an enormous amount of planning, a lot of engineering skill. For its period, it was the most complex and expensive defensive system in the world outside of China.
The first hurdle, a giant moat. Beyond that, an outer terrace. Next, a brand new outer wall, 10 feet tall and 6.5 feet thick. The final and by far the most impressive line of defense would be the original massive inner wall, completely rebuilt and anchored by its 96 giant towers.
Each tower is its own individual little castle. So to conquer the walls of the city, it would mean penetrating the moat, the outer walls, the inner wall, 3 lines of defense, and then conquering all of these individual castles one by one.
It's an extremely clever system. All the angles, all the possibilities for the technology of the time are covered.
The work was completed just in time. Attila's scouts crested a hill only to see the hardcore fortress of Constantinople. Attila would never breach the Byzantines' capital city.
The city was secure because of its walls. There are any number of times in the history of the Byzantine Empire where attackers get as far as the walls of the city, but they can go no further.
For 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire would be saved by its city walls, from the Huns and Arabs to the Russians and Turks.
The survival of Constantinople for as long as it did survive was very much due to the fact that it was a walled city which was almost impregnable.
With the completion of its land barrier, Byzantine engineers next sought to protect the city from waterborne threats. Their solution was ingenious and highly effective. A giant chain, one of the biggest ever built. Byzantine blacksmiths first forged a massive iron chain, roughly 5 football fields in length. An estimated 750 links, each measured 2 feet. The links would float on wooden logs. The Byzantine Navy could drag the chain across the Golden Horn, cutting off the harbor. Finally protected from its enemies, Constantinople cashed in.
The walls of Constantinople were so thick and so large and so successful because they had to be. Constantinople was extremely rich, and it's like a bank with a very significant vault. It was the richest city in the world.
Nearly all the world's most important trade routes intersected at the city. Wealth from as far away as Egypt, China, and Russia all passed through the Byzantine capital on its way to the west. But with money pouring into the empire, enemies began to storm the countryside, looking for the spoils.
The capital may have been bulging with success, but the empire was steadily shrinking as the frontiers fell one after another to marauding tribes. By the death of Theodosius II in 450 AD, the Mediterranean Sea, which had once been like Rome's private lake, now looked like a huge ocean against which the empire was nothing more than a beach resort. Reviving Constantine's Rome would be the single obsession of a very controversial emperor who would marry a very dynamic woman who possessed very special skills.
Theodosius II nearly bankrupted the empire trying to buy off Attila. He paid the Huns as much as 2,100 pounds of gold a year. Throughout the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had been steadily disintegrating under the iron fist of barbaric tribes. In 476, the last Roman emperor abdicated the throne. To many, the Roman Empire had finally fallen.
But did it really? Did it really fall? Because at the same time here in Constantinople, the Eastern Empire is thriving. It's prospering. And in 527 AD, an emperor named Justinian comes to the throne, who's not only completely committed to recodifying all of Roman law, he's bent on reconquering Constantine's empire.
Justinian I ruled during the Byzantine Empire's golden age. Yet, ironically, the man who lusted after the glory of ancient Rome was an outsider.
Well, the Emperor Justinian was born a peasant in what is now northern Yugoslavia, and he came with his uncle Justin to Constantinople to seek their fortunes.
His 40-year reign would be marked by intellectual brilliance, an unparalleled work ethic, and unbridled ruthlessness. 2 years before ascending to the throne, Justinian married a beautiful, strong-willed woman named Theodora. But there was just one problem. Theodora was a former burlesque dancer. So to take her checkered past out of the equation, Justinian simply promoted her. The day he was crowned emperor, he named Theodora as his co-empress. Her ascension to power sent shockwaves through the Byzantine aristocracy.
She was supposedly a prostitute hanging out around the hippodrome, involved in things like bear dancing. Not exactly sure what happens in bear dancing, but it definitely was not such a great thing. And she had a very active sex life.
Together, Justinian and Theodora would rule the empire as equals.
She must have been highly intelligent, and she must have been very wily, very successful at court politics.
Justinian quickly realized that his legacy would be built on restoring the bygone glory of ancient Rome. He began by reclaiming Western territories that had been lost over the years. Back home in Constantinople, Justinian went on a construction spree.
Bad news is, to pay for this building, he went on a ballistic campaign of taxation, which was just as popular then as it probably would have been now. Along with the taxes, he tries to control or stamp out any form of pagan celebration, the study of the ancient philosophers at Athens, gambling, prostitution, adultery, homosexuality, any Christian that doesn't see it his way, and the Jews. He didn't have a lot of fans. But so what? He's an emperor. He's not listening to approval ratings. But you know what? He should have.
As Justinian tightened his grip on the people, the city's resentment turned to rage. And unlike other civilizations, where the masses had no place to voice their anger, the Byzantines had their hippodrome. The hippodrome was the center of Constantinople's public life. Conceived as a stadium for chariot racing, it could hold as many as 100,000 people. Construction of the hippodrome had taken place over centuries. It was a gigantic task incorporating every known building technique. Shaped like an enormous U and modeled after Rome's renowned Circus Maximus, Constantinople's hippodrome was nearly a third of a mile long and wider than a modern-day football field. But the site its architects had chosen sloped severely to the south.
and there they built vaulted substructures. As is common in ancient Rome, vaulted substructures to create a level platform.
Freemen and masons were brought in from around the Mediterranean. Their first task, to build the substructure's arched wall 4 stories tall. The arches created a gallery for shops and cafes. Above the substructure, 2 tiers of columns and more than 30 stone rows surrounded the sand-covered racing track. Like all Byzantine emperors before him, Justinian sat in an imperial box called the Kathisma, giving the Byzantines a rare glimpse of their ruler.
It was a combination of sports stadium, public spectacle stadium, imperial propaganda, pulpit, all those things. It could seat huge numbers of people.
Huge bets were wagered by fans of the various teams, the blues, greens, reds, and whites.
They were like political factions in our world, and so disputes over soccer results as today, or disputes over chariot races, could take on a significant political dimension in Byzantium.
The Hippodrome was one of the architectural glories of Constantinople. But in 532 AD, it would also become the site of one of the most brutal acts of an emperor against his people. One day in early January, Justinian, by now wildly unpopular thanks to his harsh policies and heavy taxes, appeared before a raucous crowd at the Hippodrome.
All of a sudden they came together, and they came together against the emperor. The ceremonial political center of the empire was right there, and you had tens of thousands of people opposed to the emperor right at the core of the empire.
The blues and the greens weren't like the Jets and the Sharks. They were factions that ran all the way from street thugs right up the political animal to the aristocracy. So when thousands and thousands of both blues and greens stormed the Hippodrome screaming, "Nika, Nika, win, win," against these horrible taxes, it would have been like both Republicans and Democrats storming the Super Bowl screaming about the same thing, which may not be a bad idea. The sad news is it turned into a riot, and the riot turned into mayhem, and a week later, 1/3 of the city lay in ashes. Justinian was so scared he was about to pack his bags and split. But thank goodness for a strong woman.
He was all prepared to get on a ship and clear off to the Asian side of the Bosporus, but the Empress Theodora, who started life as an actress/prostitute, said, "I've got this far, I'm not giving up now, you know, stay and fight." So he did.
Theodora's words convinced Justinian, and his response would be calculated and horrifying. He dispatched his generals to gather a force and march to the Hippodrome.
The conclusion of the Nicaea riot is one of these events of biblical proportion. Justinian calls the rebels to meet in the Hippodrome, suggesting that he may compromise with them. But in fact, he gets them into the Hippodrome, closes the gates, and they are massacred by the imperial troops.
Within minutes, all the rebels within its walls had been systematically slaughtered. The center of Constantinople's public life had become the killing grounds for an estimated 30,000 people.
He was an approachable and gentle man who could, with a quiet voice, order the murder of thousands of people.
The capital lay in ruins, but in the ashes, Justinian spied opportunity. Now, he would re-engineer an everlasting legacy in the name of absolute power, his own. From the ruins of Constantinople would rise one of the world's most magnificent churches that would become the center for a new religion and a monument to Byzantine engineering. Legend says that a Byzantine princess who